Chapter 13, Nationalism, Imperialism, and the Great War. Part 2, the Great War, that is World War I, 1914 to 1918. The mounting dangers of nationalist diplomacy. The royalty and aristocracy and their upper middle-class associates of Europe had long treated wars and diplomacy as private or personal games of the members of their class. This was most amazingly a class in which a good number of the European royalty in the early years of the 20th century were direct descendants of Queen Victoria of England, and thus even first cousins, as were at the time her grandsons English King George, German Emperor Wilhelm, and Russian Tsar Nicholas. Wars and diplomacy were considered the business of their class alone. Involving the masses of peasants, townsmen, and industrial workers in this game was considered inappropriate, even highly dangerous, as the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 1800s had clearly demonstrated. Armies and envoys were understood to be the tools of the ruling classes, to be used to promote the interests of the reigning kings and emperors and their personal dynasties. But the rising spirit of nationalism was drawing the masses into this game, clearly enhancing the powers of the ruling class players, but also drawing the European heads of states forward towards a conflict that they would soon discover was way beyond their ability to manage or control. The passions of a fully armed society, and not just the ruling class and its private armies, once mobilized, would move in the direction that passion, and not diplomatic good sense, would take the nations of Europe. Germany's new emperor, Wilhelm, was becoming an increasing source of concern to the other players. Wilhelm demanded a greater share in the imperialist game than had just previously been afforded Germany. Also, despite the efforts at Berlin by European envoys to put some order to the process by which the Turkish or Ottoman Empire found itself crumbling, piece by piece, in southeastern Europe, the Balkan Peninsula continued to offer dangerous opportunities for trouble. Landlocked Austria-Hungary had been looking for expansion into that area and the possibility of acquiring a place to plant a naval base of its own in the Adriatic and thus the Mediterranean Sea, as had been its chief competitor in that region, Russia, for roughly the same reasons, but also Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia. This potential for growing conflict among these interested powers drew the other European players, England, France, Italy, Germany, etc., into the Balkan game as well. And soon, formal alliances were drawn up to buttress the interests of one side or the other. Thus, by the early 1900s, the ideal of the concert of Europe had been replaced by a deeply divided Europe. On the one side of this division were the powers of the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. This alliance was formed to check the growth of another new alliance, that of the Central Powers of the Triple Alliance, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, and, for a while anyway, Italy. War clouds began to gather. The first Moroccan crisis, 1905-1906, here we've seen Wilhelm was very unhappy about Germany's lack of a grand overseas empire such as the British and the French possessed. And he did. He felt it was a part of the result of a conspiracy of the French and British to keep Germany from its place in the sun. He resented especially deeply the 1904 agreement by which France recognized Britain's dominance in Egypt in exchange for Britain's recognition of French dominance in Morocco, supported by Italy and Spain. Germany had been part of the 1881 agreements on Morocco, but had not been included in this new agreement. Wilhelm fumed. Thus, in 1905, Wilhelm sailed to Morocco to meet with the Moroccan Sultan and offered German protection in defense of Moroccan sovereignty. A huge diplomatic crisis thus resulted. To avoid a mounting confrontation, all parties finally agreed to a conference to be held the following year, The conference confirmed the sovereignty of Morocco, but in fact allowed for both Spain and France, not Germany, to serve as the protectors of that sovereignty. Germany was still excluded from a role there. Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1908. Then, with no warning, Austria-Hungary simply annexed the Balkan territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina, infuriating the Serbs, who had a huge interest in the same region as an addition to their Greater Serbia, and as a path of access to the sea. Serbia was also landlocked. Serbs burned with a deep bitterness against the Austrians over this land grab, but this land grab also widened the divide between Austria and Russia, which was a strong supporter of Serbia, caused some consternation with Austria's ally Germany, which had not been consulted prior to the event, and forced France and Britain, both neither in a position to help Serbia nor willing yet to help Russia, to stand off, very unhappy over the event. Turkey, however, seemed content to receive monetary compensation for its loss of another 2 provinces. But in general, feelings were running very raw in Europe's capitals. The Second Moroccan Crisis, 1911. Morocco was not doing well under French and Spanish protection. The Sultan's finances were in crisis mode, and unrest among the Moroccans was building. The French decided to send French troops into Morocco to protect the lives of foreigners, upsetting greatly Wilhelm, who saw this simply as a ploy for the French to add Morocco to its North African empire. He countered the French move by sending a German gunboat to Morocco to protect German citizens, and another crisis erupted. But France, and Britain, who was backing France, refused to be intimidated, and Wilhelm backed down. War fever refused to cool down, however. Nationalists of all the major European countries seemed to want a street fight of some kind to finally settle the matter of Europe's power alignment. But what they failed to realize was that such a fight was not destined to be merely an afternoon sporting event. The powers seemed so evenly balanced at this point that, once underway, such a conflict would simply stalemate itself into a long, unrelenting bloodletting, a kind that would result only in a huge loss of political strength by all parties, the kind that would in the end, should there ever be an end, resolve nothing. But passions at this point had greatly overridden cool logic. A war now seemed inevitable. War finally breaks out. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, June the 28th, 1914. The absorption of Bosnia-Herzegovina by Austria was by no means a finished matter. Serbia was in no mood to accept this development, and Austria knew it had work to do to complete the absorption of these Balkan provinces. When in June it was announced that the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, acting on behalf of his 84-year-old uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph, would be visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, Serbian nationalists, including even members of the Serbian government, planned his assassination. They wished to disrupt Austria's plan to create a new triple monarchy, Austria, Hungary, and now also a Slavonic state, under the Austrian emperor's authority. Austria's plan would have ended the Serbian dream of an independent Greater Serbia. Somehow, Austria needed to be stopped. Austria's declaration of war on Serbia. Tragically, despite a number of blunders, the assassination succeeded, throwing Europe into diplomatic chaos. At this point, Austria wanted to destroy Serbia, but needed German backing. Wilhelm was reluctant to get involved in such a tangle, but also knew that German support was vital in keeping the Austro-Hungarian Empire from falling apart. He had to support Austria. Aware of this backing, the Austrian cabinet placed extremely heavy demands on Serbia to allow Austria to take over the search in Serbia for the Serbian criminals, presuming a Serbian refusal and thus, in effect, precipitating the war sought by Austria. Surprisingly, most of the demands were agreed on by the Serbian authorities. But Austria insisted that not most, but all of the demands be met by Serbia. When Serbia stalled, Austria felt it had the justification it needed, and on July 28th declared war on Serbia. Austria supposed that this would remain a quick local war, as most of the wars in the Balkans had been, but Austria foolishly had failed to take note of the fact that things were very different in the European diplomatic world at that point. Russia joins in. It was now Russia's turn to decide what to do. Russia was not only the protector of Serbia, it saw in this outbreak of war the opportunity to take advantage of the crisis to seize Constantinople and complete its dream of possessing its own port with direct access to the Mediterranean. But Russia was not really prepared for a major war, and Tsar Nicholas was well aware of that fact. Yet he could not hold back his own ministers, who wanted a war nonetheless. They demanded a general mobilization. Nicholas knew well that this would constitute a declaration of war, and by the terms of the dual alliance would automatically bring Germany into the war as well. But he finally gave in to his ministers, and on July 29th, the Russian cabinet called for mobilization. A few hours later, he received a conciliatory letter from his cousin Wilhelm, but it was too late to call off the mobilization. Russia was at war. Germany and France join in. Germany reacted immediately to the news of the Russian mobilization with the demand that the Russians immediately back down, and declared war August the 1st on Russia when Russia failed to do so. Germany then sent a letter to France demanding to know whether or not France was intending to stay out of the conflict, received an ambiguous reply, and thus most unwisely declared war on France August the 3rd. The German invasion of Belgium and Britain's entry into the war. Following an older plan laid out by General von Schlieffen back in the late 1800s, a strategy that worked well for the Germans when they quickly crushed France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the German intent was to immediately march on France and quickly seize Paris, leaving the French largely unable to remain in the conflict that was fast unfolding. But to do so, German troops would have to pass through Belgium, whose steadfast neutrality during any European conflict had been guaranteed by treaty, not only by England and France, but also by Germany. Thus, Germany sent a request to Belgium August the 2nd for permission to pass through the country in order to attack France. But Belgium refused permission, and on August the 4th, Germany crossed the border into Belgium anyway. This then led Britain to declare war on Germany for having broken the neutrality treaty. Britain claimed to be acting to protect that guarantee and its ally France. Italy, however, refused to support its allies Germany and Austria, claiming that it had agreed to support them only in a defensive war, not in a war of aggression. Italy thus at this point remained neutral. Turkey joins the German-Austrian side. After some indecision on the matter, the British had after all been supporters of the Turks in their troubles with the Russians and the Austrians. The Turks, impressed by German military professionalism, decided to come into the war on the side of Germany. Whether or not this would add much to the joint German-Austrian effort was at this point somewhat debatable. But in any case, it put Turkey squarely into the war. 1914. A bloody stalemate quickly sets in, and the slaughter is terrible to behold. The Western Front. In the first month, August, of this long developing war, things looked pretty much the shape in Belgium and France that it would maintain for the next 4 years. The Germans had expected to swing through a relatively defenseless Belgium and descend directly on Paris before the French could get organized. Without Paris, France was defenseless. Thus, the march through Belgium, which Germany expected would bring a hostile British response, but the action was supposed to be so swift that by the time the British got moving in defense of Belgium and France also got itself mobilized, Paris would be in the hands of Germany and the war effectively would be over. But Germany was not expecting such stiff resistance from the Belgians, which slowed the surprise move down greatly. The Germans were furious at the audacity of the Belgians and poured their wrath out onto the population of this small country, civilians included. So savage was the behavior of the Germans that the label Huns came to mind to those watching the German action. This would later come to haunt greatly the German national image. Also, Britain was indeed able to get some of its small army, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, as it would be termed during the war, in place in Belgium, at least sufficient to help slow down the momentum. And France frantically mobilized whatever resources it could, and though being forced to fall back in the face of the much better prepared German army, was able to slow down and then grind to a halt the German offensive just north of the Paris suburbs. This halting of the German offensive was much the same along a line that curved eastward and then north through northern France, from the Rhine River in the east to the Belgian border and into western Belgium along the North Sea in the west. Here, a well-dug-in battle line would hold rather permanently, barely moving but a few miles back and forth from its original position laid out in the first month of the war. Despite 4 years of bloody assault and counter-assault, millions of men would be sacrificed in the process, all without any seeming effect in breaking the murderous stalemate that settled in along this long line of battle. The Eastern Front. Another long but more changeable line of battle ran through Eastern Europe from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Balkan Mountains of Serbia in the south. Russia and Germany were engaged against each other in the north, Russia and Austria in the middle portions of the line, and Serbia and Austria in the south. Russia had a huge but ill-equipped and poorly trained army to throw at Germany, but was the first to attack. However, the attack failed, despite Germany's initial focus on the war in the west with France, and Russia immediately found itself in trouble when one of its large field armies was skillfully surrounded and forced to surrender to the Germans. Russia still had more men to bring into the war, but this initial defeat would be merely the beginning of many troubles the Russians would experience in continuing a war they now had no idea of how to pull out of without a huge loss of national pride. In the central part of the line of engagement, the Russians were facing an Austrian army of equally inferior quality, in great part because of its multinational character. Here the war bogged down along a line that reached from the Carpathian Mountains in the south to Silesia in the north, and the efforts of both sides to move the line proved to be dismal failures. In the south, the Serbs were able, for the time being, to hold back the Austrians, but they had much smaller resources at their command, and thus time was not on their side. 1915 and 1916. The extremely ugly war seems to have no end in sight. The slaughter continues. As Christmas 1914 came and went, so with it went the idea that the war would be over by Christmas. Along the entire Western Front, soldiers had dug deep trenches and settled into a life of moving back and forth between the rear and forward trenches, going into action and then falling back to recover whatever was left of a unit anyway, in the rear. The routine never varied. At the front, the soldiers awaited the pounding of the enemy lines by heavy artillery before being ordered up out of the trenches in order to cross thick lines of barbed wire and no man's land filled with shell holes and dead and decaying bodies, facing enemy rifle and machine gun fire as they went, until the remaining soldiers were ordered to retreat after having failed to dislodge the enemy from their trenches. On and on it went. The Germans got the brilliant idea of introducing poisonous gas with the hope of clearing the enemy trenches before their assaults. But while this proved deadly, it did not prove as effective as they had hoped in clearing the enemy lines. And soon the British and French were attempting the same tactic, now employing gas masks to protect themselves in the process. Between the gas attacks and the constant barrage by heavy enemy artillery, life on the front was a person's worst nightmare, one that refused to go away. There was no escaping the slaughter. The casualty list soon numbered in the millions on both sides. Other countries joined in. It seems strange that with the horrifying experience of the Great War, as it was coming to be called, by this point a year old, any other countries would want to get involved. But political folly is not unknown in high political places. For Bulgaria, there was in fact a good reason for joining the war, to get back the lands that it lost to Serbia and Greece in the Balkan Wars. In this, they largely succeeded until the war turned against their German allies in 1918. Italy, however, was another story. Italians were deeply divided about the war. In one of the many secret treaties being issued during the war, the British and the French in April of 1915 promised the Italian government lands taken from Austria along the upper Adriatic Sea coast and along the southern slopes of the Alps, plus the possibility of picking up colonial territory from the Germans in Africa. And although many Italians were adamantly opposed to getting involved in the war for any reason, pro-war enthusiasts, led especially by the fiery D'Annunzio, finally got most of Italy worked up for war. Finally, in May, Italy declared war, coming in on the side of the British and French against Italy's former allies, Germany and Austria. Not all Italians would be happy about this. Italy was really not prepared mentally or physically for such a war. As it turned out, the Italians were unable to dislodge the Austrians from the mountainous Italian provinces of Trentino, despite repeated efforts. Finally, they would find themselves in a humiliating retreat in the face of an advancing Austrian army in late 1917, after the fall of the Italian forward position at Caporetto. Romania also decided to enter the war, August 1916, after promises by Britain and France for territorial compensations were made to it, similar to those made to Italy. When in September Romania invaded Hungarian Transylvania to collect on those promises, they were only briefly successful in holding that territory before they were thrown back by a joint attack of Austria and Bulgaria. Before the year was out, Romania had yielded not only its capital city, Bucharest, but most of its land to the invading Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian forces. Romania was effectively knocked out of the war. Serbia is crushed. In the fall of 1915, Austria-Hungary and its allies, Germany and Bulgaria, joined forces to hit the Serbians hard. The Serbians were forced to retreat, leaving their capital Belgrade in enemy hands, even falling back into the Albanian mountains, and finally being chased down even there. Remnants of the Serbian army were finally, with British and French help, able to escape to Greece. In all, the Serbs lost over 1 million men, more than a quarter of its population and over half of its male population. The 1916 Brusilov offensive. The years 1915 did not go well for Russia. The Germans pushed the Russians out of Warsaw as well as the Polish lands further to the east. But the Russians planned to open up an offensive in June of 1916, the so-called Brusilov offensive, against the Austrians in the hopes not only of relieving the German-Austrian pressure on the Russian-Ukraine region, but of retaking some of the lost Polish territory. The offensive was designed also to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, where the Germans had earlier that year opened a major offensive on the Western Front. The Brusilov offensive came to an end in September when both armies faced total exhaustion, and when Russian troops had to be withdrawn to try to help the retreating Romanians. The net result of this massive encounter between the two sides was the smashing of the Austro-Hungarian army, which subsequently would have to rely increasingly on German support to conduct its campaigns. But the offensive had also been very costly to the Russian army, in equipment as well as men. This would mark the high point of the Russian role in the war. The battles of Verdun and the Somme, 1916. In the late winter, February of 1916, the Germans opened up a major offensive against the French line at the fortress city of Verdun. They literally reduced to rubble the complex fortifications of Verdun, hoping to annihilate completely the French troops gathered there. It was expected that this would open such a huge hole in the French line that the French would be thrown into disarray, and the Germans could then move on the French capital at the end of the war. Massive amounts of German power would be thrown into this operation. But the Germans had not counted on the stiff resistance that the French offered, even amidst the rubble, and the French line held, as more French divisions were brought into position by the determined French General Pétain. By July, it was obvious to the Germans that their plan was not working. Verdun had been a gamble, which had failed to yield any significant gains for the Germans, despite the heavy costs involved, with somewhere between 1/3 and 500,000 casualties on both sides. By July, much of the action now moved north to the Somme River Valley, when on the 1st of the month, the British opened up a major summer offensive against the German line. The goal was both to take pressure off the French at Verdun, which it did, and to do what the Germans had attempted to do at Verdun, open up a gap in the enemy lines, which, as at Verdun, it did not do. Massed attacks on German lines failed to dislodge the Germans, and hundreds of thousands of Allied British and French troops died in the attempt. The attacks continued through August, September, growing even heavier, and October, until finally in November the rains turned the devastated land into knee-deep mud, and the offensive ground to a halt. An interesting new item of war was introduced at the Somme, the British tank. But the British had not yet learned to maximize its use with ground troops, and at this point it did little to impact trench warfare. Revolution in Russia, 1917. The Russian February Revolution. Although Russia's army greatly outnumbered its enemies, it lacked the supplies necessary to make it an effective fighting force. Weapons and ammunition were always in short supply, demoralizing the Russian soldier who was expected to fight on empty-handed. Russian civilians were well aware of these problems and were quick to blame the Tsar and his government for these scandalous shortcomings. Very unwisely, in September of 1915, the Tsar decided that he personally must lead the military from the front and left the governing of Russia to his wife. and the Tsarina, in turn, left matters to the nasty-smelling and crude mystic monk Rasputin, who made and unmade governments with his own personal appointments, further scandalizing the Russians in their dwindling respect for their imperial government. By the beginning of 1917, wartime shortages had hit the civilian population as cruelly as it had the military. Food in the cities was very difficult to obtain, and grumbling turned into full-scale protests in March by Petrograd, that is, St. Petersburg, workers, joined by masses of women. The protest built force over the next days, and soldiers sent to restore order began to join the protesters. The Tsar abdicates. Word reached the Tsar at the front that even his own bodyguard had joined the revolt, and under advisement of his generals, Nicholas simply abdicated his throne, March the 15th. When his brother, Grand Duke Michael, refused to take the throne, no other Romanov stepped forward to take the reins of government, thus bringing 300 years of Romanov imperial government to an end in Russia. A democratic provisional government takes over in Russia. The Russian parliament, the Duma, tried to bring order to the chaos by setting up a provisional government on the same day that a Soviet, that is, Council of Workers, was established in Petrograd. At first, under the presidency of Prince Lvov, the Duma set about decreeing a variety of social reforms and called for a national election for a national assembly specifically assigned the task of designing a new Russian constitution. All this activity gave the outward appearance that now Russia had become a democracy. Actually, what it had become was hardly decided at that point. From this vantage point, it could even now be claimed that the war had become a great moral matter of democracy, that is, Britain, France, Italy, and now Russia against autocracy, the empires of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Turkey. The world took note of this fact, in particular Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. Kerensky's fateful decision to keep Russia in the war on the side of democracy. Eventually, heading up the new provisional government was Kerensky and his party of constitutional Democrats. Understanding the dynamic of this war no more than had the Tsar, Kerensky made the fateful decision to keep Russia in the war, to pursue the great democratic cause, that is also to redeem Russia's tarnished honor. But Kerensky proved no more able to keep Russia together in the face of the demands of war than the Tsar, and the Russian soldiers now began to protest against the new government. Lenin and the Bolshevik or Communist October Revolution. This gave the Bolshevik leader Lenin the opportunity to seize power in both St. Petersburg. Footnote: St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd during the war to give it a more Russian sound. Soon it would be renamed yet again as Leningrad, in honor of the leader of the Communist Revolution in Russia. And then, with the fall of the communist system in Russia at the beginning of the 1990s, it would retake its original name, St. Petersburg. Anyway, the Bolsheviks took power in St. Petersburg and also Moscow on the promise of taking Russia out of the war. This clever move made him instantly more popular among the Russian commoners than their new democratic champion Kerensky. Lenin soon went on to make good on this promise and took Russia out of the war with the Russian-German armistice in December. Russia's horrible civil war now begins. Russia was at this point finally out of one war, ready to face now a new one, an internal civil war among various Russian groups, one that would prove to be a war that would prove to be even more devastating to Russia than had been the Great War that they had just dropped out of. Section 2. America enters the war. Quote, he kept us out of the war, unquote. Wilson was American president when World War I broke out in 1914. He correctly understood that this war was mostly an ego battle among the European empires, and that the United States had absolutely no reason to get involved. In 1916, he ran for re-election as president, in part on the position that he kept us out of war. The one-sidedness of American neutrality. It had never been easy trying to stay neutral in a war that affected America's vital business and trade with Europe, as European enemies attempted to isolate each other from resupply by America on the high seas. The British effectively threw a naval blockade against Germany, which prevented the Germans from receiving much-needed shipments of even food coming from America. Both the United States and South American countries, such as Argentina, which were also major exporters of the food products. Americans complained bitterly about the way the British prevented neutral America from conducting trade with Germany in non-war goods, but the British ignored these complaints. Eventually, the Americans responded by simply devoting their trade as a neutral nation to England and its ally France, which rewarded American businesses richly by purchasing everything America could send them. Germany was thus left out in the cold, as its people drew closer to starvation. The Germans countered by attempting to establish a blockade of their own around England, using submarines as the effective instrument. But submarines were viewed as inhuman instruments of war because they could not rescue the sailors of ships they had sunk. Thus, the British blockade took on a legitimacy that the German blockade failed to receive in the eyes of Americans, although actually the sinking of American shipping was quite light. This played into the hands of the English propaganda machine operating very effectively in America with the American press. The Germans never really learned how to shape the narrative of events in Europe that could draw sympathy of Americans. The sinking of the Lusitania. In May of 1915, a German U-boat sank the massive English luxury liner Lusitania just off the coast of Ireland, with nearly 1,200 people drowned, over 100 of whom were Americans, including some very prominent citizens. The Germans had warned ahead of the dangers of bringing a luxury liner into the war zone, especially with huge amounts of contraband war materials in the ship's hold. Indeed, what the Lusitania had been doing was very illegal under the international rules of war as they stood in those days. Nonetheless, American fury was immense, and the Germans backed down by promising no more civilian liners would be targeted. For the moment, the crisis passed, and America maintained its neutrality, as lopsided as it was in the way it favored only Britain and France. But the Germans could do little about it, unless they wanted to make an enemy of America. The Germans resumed submarine warfare, but pushed to exhaustion by a starving Germany, the Kaiser in early 1917 made the fateful decision to resume U-boat attacks on shipping, out of a desperate hope to force the Americans to take a truly neutral side in the war. This resumption of U-boat attacks on American shipping headed to England and France instead served only to outrage the Americans. The outrage was so great that it easily pushed America towards a readiness to go to war with Germany over this matter. Then there was this matter of an incredibly stupid telegram sent around about this time by the Germans to the Mexicans and intercepted by the British and purposely placed in American hands, inviting the Mexicans to go to war against America under the promise that the Germans would help them recover territory previously lost to the U.S. if they joined the Germans in this struggle. The Mexicans, of course, were not that foolish, and the telegram was ignored, but its exposure had helped immensely to stir up the demand of Americans for war against Germany. But were these sufficient reasons in themselves now to take America into the war? Was the situation for America any different than it was in 1915, when Wilson was able to use diplomacy to keep heads cool and America out of the war? But it was actually events in Russia that would tip the balance for Wilson towards the decision to finally take America into the European war. The impact of the Russian Revolution on Wilson's thinking. Subsequent to the revolutionary events in Russia, which occurred just as Wilson was being installed for his second term in office, Wilson no longer viewed the European conflict as a mere brawl among European powers. The collapse of the imperial government in Russia in early 1917 and its replaced by a democratic provisional government led by Kerensky's constitutional Democrats certainly gave the war a new look. Now on one side were the democracies, England, France, Italy, and complements of the February Revolution in Russia, that country as well. Opposing them were the imperial governments, autocracies, as Wilson termed them, of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. To Wilson, the war took on the appearance of being the good guys versus the bad guys. Now the war seemed to Wilson to have a moral cause worthy of American involvement. Thus, on the 2nd of April, 1917, he called Congress together to request a declaration of war. Democracy's crusade for democracy against evil autocracy. In his speech delivered before Congress, Wilson waxed eloquent and amazingly wrong in his appraisal of how recent Russian events had changed the game. Quote, "Does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Russia was known by those who knew it best to have been always, in fact, democratic at heart, in all the vital habits of her thoughts, in all the intimate relationships of her people that spoke their natural instinct, their habitual attitude towards life. The autocracy that crowned the summit of her political structure, long as it had stood and terrible as was the reality of its power, was not in fact Russian in origin, character, or purpose, and now it has been shaken off, and the great, generous Russian people have been added in all of their naive majesty and might to the forces that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice and for peace. Here is a fit partner for a league of honor." End of quote. Oh, this was an amazing misrepresentation of Russia in every way possible. It was also very characteristic of the romantic view of human nature held by very privileged members of the American intellectual class, such as America's president, but also former Princeton professor, belonged to, members of which tended to be far, far removed from the harsh realities of life lived by the vast majority of people on this planet. These were harsh realities, soon to be encountered with America's entry into the pointless war, that sadly not only Wilson was about to encounter, but also the American people as well. Instead of serving some great cause of democracy, America would end up serving only the grim imperial interests of Britain and France and little else. And ultimately, soon coming to face with this unpleasant reality, it would break the spirit and health of Wilson in odd ways the American people. Quote, "To make the world safe for democracy," unquote. In any case, Wilson represented the war as the opportunity to engage America in another one of the crusades of political reform that so captivated his imagination. To the American people, he now proclaimed that the war was an historical struggle between the forces of world democracy and the tyranny of autocracy, and that America needed to get involved on the side of democracy to make the world safe for democracy. He and the American people needed to take up the challenge of defeating evil autocracy and bringing democracy and consequently full political freedom, prosperity, and justice to the world. Wilson's idealism was boundless. He sold the war to the American people not only on how this was going to spread democracy everywhere in the world, but that in doing so this would finally bring a lasting peace to the world. To Wilson, democracies were always presumed to be reasonable societies, not grasping, not bullying and brawling like the European autocrats of the old world. According to Wilson and other American and European idealists or humanists, by natural instinct, democracies used calm reason in pursuing their national politics and sought merely for international understanding in their engagement in the world of international relations and diplomacy. With the victory of world democracy in this terrible but necessary war, governments built on power holders and their autocratic self-interests would be ended forever. Wilson fashioned the idea that the war which broke out in 1914 had been nothing more than the result of the disastrous policies of the ruling classes of the autocracies, rather than the nationalist urge of the masses or commoners of nearly all European nations. In his lofty speech before Congress, Wilson outlined clearly the cause he was asking Americans to give their lives for. Quote, "We are glad, now that we see the facts with no veil of false pretense about them, to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations, great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life in obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifice we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." End of his quote. To make the world itself at last free. According to Wilson, the bright new world that was unfold with democratic victory, people everywhere would be ruled by unselfish reason rather than by greedy brute force. Once freed from the tyranny of power and power holders, that is, the imperialistic autocrats, mankind would live by the higher moral power of logic and truth. Thus, the last great wartime struggle, no matter how violent it might become, would be well worth the bloody sacrifice of many American young men, for it would make the world itself at last free. His concluding remarks restate the matter clearly. Again, we quote, "There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right, by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations, and make the world itself at last free. To such a task we can dedicate our lives and our fortunes, everything that we are and everything that we have, with the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured. God helping her, she can do no other." America's Democratic allies have a different agenda. Tragically, Wilson's take on the war was not exactly how America's new allies, England and France, saw the war. At their home front, in their national capitals, they were indeed democracies. Actually, they were empires too, with both England and France controlling vast empires in Africa and Asia, and with clear intentions of extending their imperial grip into the Muslim Middle East once the Ottoman Turks were knocked out of the way. But they played along with Wilson. They were certainly glad to get American help in crushing their autocratic enemies, and thus played along with Wilson's crusading idealism. American assistance would likely break the terrible stalemate that had set in on the war and finally bring their side to victory in this long and bloody and largely pointless struggle. America gears up. Actually, America was not immediately ready to go to war. The U.S. Army was very small in size, having been, since the end of the Civil War and the American Indian Wars, no apparent need for a large force, except to fight nationalist insurgents in the Philippines, early 1900s, and Mexican raiders set loose to do damage along the Mexican-American border. Pancho Villa was still conducting raids along the border at the time of America's entry into the Great War in Europe. General Pershing was sent ahead in June of 1917 at the head of a small American military force to give tangible evidence of America's commitment to the war cause in Europe. But before America gets seriously involved, millions of troops would have to be trained for battle. It would not be until the late spring of the next year, 1918, before the Americans would arrive in strength in Europe. The Americans joined the fight. The French and English attempted to direct American troops into their own ranks as replacement troops for their exhausted armies. But American Commanding General Pershing refused to use American troops as mere replacements in the ranks of the French and British. He demanded that they be given their own sector along the line of battle, where they could fight under their own flag as a fully American army. The Allies reluctantly agreed, having no basis on which to refuse this American demand. And thus, in early 1918, Americans began taking their position at the Belleau Wood and St. Mihiel sector near Verdun. Having helped to push back the German lines in those sectors in the late summer, they then took on the Germans dug in with the Argonne Forest, which proved to be much slower going and more murderous for the Americans. But the soldiers conducted themselves well. Wilson's 14 points. In January of 1918, Wilson went before Congress to outline what he expected to be the specific terms of the peace that America was fighting to secure. The terms were presented as 14 points, including the end to secret treaties, which Wilson supposed were the primary cause of the war in the first place, the guarantee of full freedom of all navigation on the high seas, a major source of American annoyance with both the Germans and the English, the adjustment of territories, such as would restore Russia, revive Poland, and return to France territory lost to Germany in 1871, the opportunity for independence of nations part of the Austro-Hungarian and Turkish Ottoman empires, and, most importantly, in Wilson's eyes, the creation of a general association of nations to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity to all states, large or small. This last point was the intellectual foundation for what would become the first truly international diplomatic organization, the League of Nations. Wilson made it clear that even for the Germans he sought only a fair or equitable peace, though he would negotiate such a peace with only a German delegation representing the majority members of the Reichstag, that is, the German National Assembly, and not the military party and the men whose creed is imperial domination. This was a clear indication that America would not deal with the Kaiser, but instead with only a German group representing the broader interests of the people of Germany. This is all very noble, but would leave the Germans at the negotiating table with hostile adversaries, having to operate from a position of incredible political weakness. Consequently, Germany be walked over by France and Britain, despite Wilson's protests, and leave Germany ultimately itching for a rematch to readjust the unfair outcome of the so-called peace talks. Hitler would play big on this German understanding of what happened under Wilson's armistice. German troubles. Meanwhile, the Germans were having tremendous difficulties keeping up their end of the war. This two-front war was draining down Germany's economic and spiritual strengths to a dangerous low. In December of 1917, the Germans signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Lenin's communist government in Russia, in which the Germans agreed to halt their assault on Russian territory, thus freeing the Russian Communist Red Army to focus its efforts completely on defeating the Russian White Armies, made up of a poorly united coalition of pro-Tsarist, Cossacks, ethnic minorities, and pro-Republicans. Part of the payoff for the Germans was the huge German territorial gains in Eastern Europe given up by the Russian communists. But the main reason the Germans had agreed to this treaty was that they would then be free to rush their vast number of German troops massed on the Russian front back to the Western Front. With this new concentration of German troops on the Western Front, they could then break through the French and British lines and grab Paris, thus collapsing French resistance and ultimately ending the war itself before the Americans could arrive in number in Europe in the spring of 1918. But the French and the British lines held firm in the face of Germany's new spring offensive, and the Germans merely exhausted themselves further in the process. Meanwhile, back in Germany itself, the population was finding itself on the brink of starvation, and movements to pull Germany out of the war were starting to form in opposition to the Kaiser's determination to fight the war to the finish.